Hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for another story here at Annie Narrates. We review stories that beautiful people like yourselves post on the internet. Today's story's title goes like this. Mom abandoned me with abusive dad, but now she turns up years later and asks for one last chance to explain everything. So I let her, and then she showed me the picture of my real dad. Oh boy. Hi. So I'm a 21-year-old woman, and recently, my mother, who ran away when I was 16, got back in touch with me. My mother, 47 female, was married to my toxic father for about 15 or 14 years before she finally ran away with her boyfriend. My mother and I were pretty much best friends when I was growing up, and I always felt like I could share everything with her. It's not like I had much of a choice either, because I wasn't allowed to have friends over. My father was a horrible human being for the most part, and escaping that house was probably when my life really began. My mother always told me that my father had not always been this way, that he was a kind and gentle soul when she first met him, which is why she fell for him. But it changed after almost a year of marriage, and it just kept getting worse eventually. She thought that bringing me into the world would make him a better person, but it didn't work, and he stayed the same. My father was evil, and even though he never used his hands, it wasn't out of kindness, but it was because he knew that his words would be enough, and would constantly suspect my mother of cheating, call her awful names, which is where I learned most curse words, and just put her down every chance he got. And with me, he was slightly better, but it would just take him one bad day to snap at me. He would pretend like I didn't even exist for the most part, but on the bad days, he would remember about me and make sure that he picked on me as well. For the first couple of times, when I was old enough to answer back, I retaliated and very narrowly escaped things that he'd throw at me out of anger, like a mug or a book, and once, even a snow globe. Of course, it was my mother who would protect me. She taught me not to talk back, even if he provoked me, because then she'd be the one who would have to clean up afterwards. That, and she didn't want me to make matters worse for myself, because at the end of the day, it was my dad who was the breadwinner, and we all depended on him to fund our lifestyle. So, I learned to stay quiet, just like my mother, and ignore whatever he would say to us. It was hard, but I did it for my mother's sake. I never really understood why she continued to stay with him for such a long time, and I would often suggest that the two of us run away. I would fantasize about running away and starting a new life with my mother, away from my father and his toxicity. Turns out, my mother had been fantasizing about the same things, just not with me. For 16 years, I put up with my father just for the sake of my mother. My maternal grandparents told us several times that we could leave whenever we wanted and come live with them if things got too bad. But my mother refused to leave my father and said that she'd made a commitment, so she needed to honor her wedding vows. I used to think it was crazy stupid for my mother to reject her one chance at getting the heck out of my father's house. But I never said anything because I thought that she had her reasons. I didn't know what her reasons were exactly, but I trusted her enough to believe that she did have some. It was just wishful thinking, but nonetheless, I prayed and hoped that someday she would find the strength to leave and take me with her. About a week after my 16th birthday, she did find the strength to leave, but unfortunately, she did not take me with her. I woke up one morning to make breakfast for myself, only to find out that my mother was nowhere to be found, and all that she left was a note on the dining table that said that she was sorry that she left me behind, but she had to make a run for it because she couldn't spend the rest of her life with my father anymore. She said that she wished that she could take me with her, but her boyfriend didn't have the resources to raise a young daughter, and I would just have to stick it out with my father, build a future for myself, and then I could finally leave. I didn't know what to do with that note, so I just kept it in my pocket and hoped that it was all just a prank and that my mother would be back to fetch me soon enough. My father woke up about an hour later and instantly started raging when he realized that my mother had left signed divorce papers on the bedside table, with a note that explained what she was doing. He went completely ballistic, and it was pretty funny to watch him go on a rampage around the house, cursing at my mother and telling me what a mistake he'd made by quote-unquote rescuing her from that dump. I didn't really understand what he meant by that, but I was too afraid to ask him. After that, it was just a blur of courts, lawyers, and people asking me if I was doing okay. My father put on his best behavior for the custody battle, which went by pretty easily because my mother made it very clear that she did not want custody of me. She tried to talk me into the parking lot afterward, but my father dragged me away because she had a chance to speak to me, and ordinarily, I would have fought back, but I didn't. Because I just didn't want to speak to my mother anymore. I did see her boyfriend a couple of times back then, and he was a much younger guy. He seemed sweet and gentle, so I knew that my mother would be just fine with him. After the divorce and custody arrangement was finalized, I never saw my mother ever again. The years following that were the hardest for me because my father just got more and more difficult to deal with. He was never a drinker before, but after my mother left, there was nothing to stop him from taking up the habit. He started drinking slowly, but soon enough, it became a dangerous habit, and I learned to stay out of his way and stay confined within my room whenever he would come back home drunk. It was usually his buddies from work who would have to carry him because that's how sloshy he would be, and it would disgust me, but I had nowhere else to go. My grandparents had pretty much cut me off after my mother abandoned us, so I knew that there was no point in trying to get them to take me in. It's not like I hadn't tried already, and I wasn't really in touch with most of my other relatives, so I didn't know who else to talk to. My father's family was not in good terms with him, so they wouldn't take me in either, and that's how I got stuck living with him until it was time for me to start college. Luckily, my father was a wealthy man because whatever he did at home, he made sure that it stayed out of his workplace. He kept his personal and professional lives separate. He would still pick on me on the bad days like he used to when I was a kid, talk down to me, and made me feel horrible about myself on the bad days. But after my mother left, there were times when he would seem heartbroken, and it felt as if he was almost humane. I occasionally even felt sorry for him. Truth be told, he mostly ignored me after my mother left, and whenever he was at home, he would just spend his time either drinking in his room or staring off into space. It was hard to hate him on those days, but then we would have one single bad day and I would stop feeling sorry for him. When it was time for me to leave for college, he dropped me off and even came with me to check out my dorm and stuff like any normal parent would. He didn't drink that day, and neither did he get drunk the night before I was supposed to leave. I was pretty surprised that he bothered to sober up just because it was an important occasion for me. On the day I finally moved out, he told me to study hard and make something of myself, so he wouldn't have to help me out anymore. After I started college, I never looked back, and my dad didn't try to reach out to me either. He paid my tuition and I was thankful for it, but that was pretty much it. He didn't try to talk to me, and I felt weird whenever I would think of contacting him. I would go home a couple of times in the year, but even then, my father and I would barely speak. He stopped picking on me too. There was just silence now, and I noticed that after I moved out, he'd even stopped drinking. I only found out why that was in my third year of college, when I received a call from my father's secretary, saying that he was in the hospital and that things weren't looking too good for him. I went to visit him that day and found out that my father had been struggling with liver cirrhosis for a while now, but had never told anybody about it. He'd gone on a drinking binge in the 3 weeks before that phone call, and that's what led him to landing up in the hospital. When I asked him why he kept the secret, he told me that he didn't want me to worry about him. He told me that he had nobody else that he could tell this to anyway, and laughed at his own miserable condition. I remember that conversation vividly because it happened to be one of the last conversations that I had with my father. I stayed in the hospital for the next 3 days with him, trying to make sense of everything. This is a man who had terrorized me my entire childhood, but now I was here praying that he would make it, because I couldn't afford to lose another parent, even if it was my emotionally toxic father. He told me that he knew he wasn't going to make it and apologized to me for everything. He said that he wished that he could have been a better husband and a better father, but he'd always been too insecure and stupid to see what he had. He believed that this was his punishment for treating my mother and me the way that he did. It was weird, but I find myself crying when I was listening to him talk about these things. He passed away in his sleep on the third night, and that's when I finally went back to my dorm. I didn't even bother to go back home because I knew that there was nothing left there anymore. I organized his funeral, but there were barely any family members who showed up. It was mostly just business associates and colleagues who had turned up to pay their last respects. All of them had nothing but nice things to say about my father, which was weird because that was not the man that I knew. I didn't know how to contact my mother, but I still tried by putting up the news of the funeral on my social media and hoping that she would find it somehow. I don't think that she did because she never showed up. A couple of months later, after the probate process was over, I inherited my childhood home and all the money left after we cleared his debts. All his other assets were to be sold off and the money was to be given to charity. He hadn't left my mother anything and I was his sole beneficiary. This happened almost a year ago, and since then, I graduated. I sold my house and rented an apartment to live in now. I haven't been in touch with any of my family members ever since my dad passed away, and I've been working for a couple of months now. I almost thought that I could have a normal life, until my mother showed up at my door a week ago. I don't know how she found me. She probably asked some of my friends for my new address. I was at home that day, and let me tell you, I almost did a double take when I realized it was my mother who was ringing the doorbell. She looked older, but she didn't look as anxious as I remember her looking when she was still living with me and my father. I hesitated to open the door, but I still went through with it because I needed answers. She smiled at me and hugged me as soon as I opened the door. I invited her in awkwardly and offered her some snacks before finally getting to the point. After some small talk, which was painfully uncomfortable, I finally asked her why she was back after almost 5 years. She got serious and told me that she had heard about my father's passing away last year, but didn't find the courage to attend the funeral. She mentioned that she'd wanted to reach out to me but didn't, yet again for the same reason. But now she finally felt brave enough to come to talk to me and said that she wanted one last chance to explain everything to me, and when I said that she could go ahead, she started talking. She told me that there were a lot of things that I didn't know about her relationship with my father. For instance, the man that I had believed was my father for so long was actually not even my father. When she told me that, I almost fell off my chair. I told her to cut it out because I was so sure that this was a prank, but she brought out a couple of documents from her purse and handed them over to me to take a look at. On going through them, I realized that I was actually not the daughter of the man that I believed to be my father for the longest time, but my real father was actually my uncle, my father's cousin, who used to come around to visit me when I was a child, but stopped after I turned 6 maybe. My mother explained that before she got married to my father, she used to date his cousin, and that's how my father met her. They were together for a really long time, and then she got pregnant. My uncle wanted her to terminate the pregnancy because he wasn't ready to have a child yet, but she insisted that it was the right time and threatened to break up with him if he said anything about termination again. So they ended up having me, and my mother moved in with my uncle, my bio dad, for a while. But things were not going too well for them. My uncle's business wasn't taking off like he had hoped it would, and my mother had already made it very clear that she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, so working was not on the table for her. Their standards of living deteriorated to the point where my mother had to shoplift baby formula for me. My father's family had refused to help them because they were against the idea of my mother forcing my uncle into fatherhood before he was ready. They wanted him to break up with her, and when he didn't, they cut him off instead. And my maternal grandparents were kind of in the same boat. They wanted my mother to come back to them and raise me alongside them, and when she refused, they said that they wouldn't help her financially either. This went on for about until I was almost 6 months old, and that's when my uncle finally snapped and told my mother that he couldn't do this anymore. So he was going back to his parents. My mother was devastated and actually showed up at my uncle's house to confront his family on the 4th of July, where they were celebrating my uncle's return with their extended family. There was a huge showdown between them, which is where my father stepped in and told my mother that he was ready to marry her and take on my responsibility as well, if she was okay with it. My father was smitten with her and my mother had always known it. So, after a couple of weeks, she agreed and my parents got married. My father was already in a well-paying position by then, so money was never an issue for him, and soon enough, my uncle had signed away his rights and my father legally took over. Their family wasn't too happy about it because at the end of the day, my mother still got her way. So now they cut my father out of their family like they had cut my uncle the first time around. This explains why my father was never on good terms with any of his family members. My mother was somehow able to get her parents back on speaking terms with her, and for a while they were all happy until my father began to show his true colors. My uncle visited me for a couple of years to see how I was doing, but then he got a great job overseas and moved away. I didn't see him anymore after that because my father didn't want him around and my mother didn't want to piss him off. My mother was obviously miserable with my father because of how horribly he used to behave with us and the fact that he constantly doubted her because he didn't feel secure in his relationship. He believed that she had only married him for money and stability, which wasn't technically untrue. She tried her best to make her marriage work for my sake, but then when I was around 14, she met her then boyfriend and now husband. They used to run into each other at the grocery store pretty often. He was the chatty new young cashier at the grocery store, and one day, he just asked her out for coffee. She couldn't say no, and that's how their story began. For 2 years, my mother continued to have this affair in secret until she finally gathered the courage to leave my father. But she knew that her boyfriend didn't earn enough to support the two of them, and she didn't have any money of her own. So she couldn't give me the lie that she knew my father could. And that's why she had to make the incredibly difficult decision of leaving me behind so she could have a better life for herself. She tried to talk to me, but I turned her away back then. So she decided that she was going to try and make herself disappear from my life. My grandparents cut me off because they just wanted out of this mess altogether, and they even cut my mother off so they wouldn't have to deal with us anymore. So I wouldn't be hurt anymore by whatever she had done. She did keep track of me and what I was doing by asking around and making fake profiles to stalk me online, but it just wasn't the same anymore, and she really missed me a lot over the past couple of years. She told me that she came back to finally make amends for whatever she did, because she knew that there was no going back in the past to change it, but the least that she could do now was to work on building a better relationship for the future. She apologized to me and told me that she was sorry about everything and hoped that I would forgive her. Now here's where I might have been the a-hole, because after I heard her entire story, I took a couple of seconds to process it, and then I got up and told her to get the hell out of my house. She looked a little taken aback, and I took advantage of that to grab her purse, walk to the door, and throw it outside. I held the door open for her and told her to get out before I had thrown her out, just like I had thrown her belongings outside. She looked at me with her mouth wide open, as if she was struggling to make sense of any of this. Looking at her face, I told her that that's exactly how I felt when she abandoned me with my father all those years ago, and now it was pretty rich of her to come back when my life was finally going well, so she could make things right. I didn't need her anymore. She wasn't there when I needed her the most, so now I knew that I could do just fine without her forever. So she could take her little apology and her sob story and get the hell out, because I wasn't falling for it. I called her a selfish and heartless mother and told her that my father had been right about her all along. When I said that about my father, she started crying and ran out of the open door. It's been a week and I haven't heard from her since. I feel like I took things a little too far, and now that I've calmed down, I feel awful. Am I the a-hole for telling my mother that my toxic father had been right about her all along? I had been wrapping my brain trying to find a way to contact her because I hadn't really bothered to ask for her phone number or anything. But today, after almost 10 days had passed, I found a visiting card that she had left for me which had fallen under the coffee table, and I had just completely ignored its existence because I was so caught up in my guilt. It's her husband's, but I think I'm going to call it and try to get to her. I still really don't know how I feel about any of this, but all I do know is that I took things too far. I don't know if this is the right thing to do or not, but I don't want to regret anything in the future and find myself wishing that I'd made things right with my mother when I had the chance. So yeah, I think I'm going to call the number on the card and take my chances. Even if she refuses to talk to me after what I said, at least I'll have the satisfaction of knowing that I tried my best. So I called the number a couple of hours ago, and her husband answered the call. He runs a stationery office supply store now, and that's the number I called. He told me in a really cold voice that he was at work right now, and his wife was at home, and that if I wanted to speak to her, then I had to call her number, which I noted down. I tried to call that number right away afterwards, but nobody answered the call. I guess my mother's husband told her that I was going to call, and that's why she didn't answer the phone. I'm going to wait for a couple of hours more to see if she calls back or not. If she does, then that's great, and if she doesn't, then, well, at least I tried. It's almost 3 in the morning right now, and I just got off a call with my mother. We talked for almost 2 hours after she called me, and I answered. I apologized to her for the things that I said the other day, and she said that it was okay. I'd earned the right to be mad at her because what she did to me wasn't fair either. She said that she had actually agreed with me, and she also agreed with my father because ultimately, she had married him for money and stability and not for love. Had it not been for me, she probably never would have even considered marrying him. And it was about time that she finally stopped pretending to be some sweet little angel from heaven who could never do anything wrong and admitted that she had been selfish in the past and treated both my father and me unfairly. She didn't feel particularly bad about my father though, because he got his revenge by mistreating her throughout their marriage and using his position as the breadwinner of the family to put her down constantly, because he knew that she had nowhere else to go. He took advantage of that fact that she was dependent on him, but whenever she realized that she did have somebody else to look out for her, she decided to go with him and give herself a real shot at happiness. She was terribly sorry for putting me through that and said that if she could go back in the past and change it, she would. But she couldn't, so all she could do was try to apologize and hope for the best. We talked a lot about everything that had happened since she left, and by the time that we hung up, we realized that both of us needed intensive therapy, both individually and together, if we wanted to have a relationship. So that's what we're going to do. Things may never go back to the way that they were before, but I really want to give our relationship a chance at least. And that was a wrap up for today's story. Thank you very much for listening. Go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe for more stories. Thanks again. We'll be seeing you in the next one.